My name is Patricia Vance, and before I tell you anything else, I need you to understand the moment my world tilted into something I could barely process. It was exactly 2 a.m. when I woke up to the buzz of a phone I hadn't touched in years. My husband's old handset, silent since he passed, lit up on the dresser like it had been waiting for that one awful minute. I reached for it with hands that wouldn't steady, and the screen showed a contact I thought would never appear again. Silas. My son. Gone 4 years. I froze. The kind of freeze where your breath stops halfway and refuses to finish. For a second I told myself it had to be a malfunction, a glitch. But the longer I stared, the more that name burned into my eyes. I couldn't bring myself to answer, so I just held the phone and listened. His voice, his real voice, came through the speaker. Mom, let me in. It's cold out here. My legs nearly gave way. I had known grief in many forms, but hearing a voice I had once kissed goodnight, a voice that should have been buried with him, brought a fear I don't wish on anyone. I walked toward the front hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. When I reached the door, I didn't open it. I moved to the small side window. My fingers shook as I lifted the corner of the curtain. He was standing on my porch. Silas. Wearing the jacket I bought him the winter before the accident. His face was pale, almost washed out under the streetlight. His eyes locked onto the window as if he had expected me to look. He raised a hand and rested it on the glass with no sound, no movement of breath, no warmth. Only stillness. Mom, please help me, he mouthed. I stumbled backward. My mind raced through every possibility. Grief, exhaustion, a breakdown, or the possibility that someone else wanted me to believe I was losing touch with reality. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in my own hallway, watching him stare at me without so much as a blink. Eventually, he walked away, quiet as a shadow, disappearing past the line of the porch light. I didn't sleep. I don't think anyone could. I sat in my living room until morning, replaying every detail, trying to pull apart what was real and what wasn't. And that's when the most frightening question settled in my chest. Did I lose my grip on reality? Or did someone want me to break? Before I go further, let me ask you something, because I know I'm not alone in this. Have you ever felt pushed into doubting yourself? Has someone close to you ever twisted your trust so sharply that you questioned your own senses? Have you ever wondered if a person you loved was using your age, your grief, or your fear to corner you? Because that's where this story truly begins. My own children, 2 adults who once kissed my cheek and promised to care for me, had been tightening a quiet trap around my life long before that call came through. They had motives. They had plans. And they were counting on me collapsing so they could take everything Arthur left behind. But they miscalculated. That night, that call, that porch, they all led me towards something they never wanted me to discover. They thought they had me cornered, but they didn't expect what came next, or what I uncovered once the shock faded and my focus sharpened. Before I continue, before I tell you exactly how far they went, let me say this, because it matters. What happened to me happens to elders every day. Subscribe so it never hits your family. Now let's go back to that moment when dawn finally broke, and I realized that the truth waiting for me was far more dangerous than any ghost. My name is Patricia, but most folks here in Willow Creek just call me Mrs. Vance. I'm a 70-year-old widow living in the same Queen and home where I raised 3 children, tended a small garden every spring, and cooked every Thanksgiving meal with more heart than technique. This house has been the center of my life for decades. Every room holds some part of me. Arthur's books on the study shelves, Silas's old guitar leaning in the corner of his room, the faded drawings Beatrice made in grade school still tucked inside a kitchen drawer. I didn't plan to grow old in quiet isolation. Arthur and I expected a warm retirement filled with grandchildren running across the porch, Sunday dinners with all 3 kids at the table, and phone calls that weren't about documents, taxes, or future planning. But life doesn't always unfold the way you picture in younger years. Sometimes it changes so gradually that you don't notice the shift until the warmth you once relied on has thinned to a faint thread. Arthur passed almost a decade ago. He was steady, dependable, and calm, everything a partner should be. Losing him felt like losing the very structure of my days. Still, I carried on. I kept the routines he loved. I read on the porch in the evenings. I kept his old phone on the dresser, not because I needed it, but because I couldn't let it go. That phone ending up being the thing that woke me the night everything changed. I'll tell you something honest. Getting older isn't frightening because of the number of candles on your birthday cake. It's frightening because you start to realize how people begin speaking to you differently, treating you differently, assessing your value not by your years of love but by how useful you still are. If you've ever felt that shift, you know exactly what I mean. You start hearing comments like, "Don't worry yourself," or "Let us handle this," or "You should focus on resting." Sometimes these phrases come wrapped in kindness, but other times they're loaded with something colder. And if you're watching this, maybe you've felt that shift too. Maybe someone has spoken to you like you couldn't possibly understand the world anymore. Maybe someone has tried to make decisions for you without asking what you wanted. It's a lonely feeling, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Before Silas died, my children were different. Not perfect, not saints, but family. Beatrice had a sharp way of speaking, efficient, fast, always calculating. But she used to laugh easily in her younger years. Theodore loved the spotlight but still came home for dinners and let me straighten his tie before events. Silas was the heart of our home. He checked on me without me asking, fixed things around the house, and called for no reason other than to talk. He was gentle in ways that carried a person through difficult days. After he passed, the house didn't just feel empty, it felt incomplete, like something essential had been taken from the air itself. The weight of his absence sat in the corners of each room. I kept his door open, the way he always preferred it, but even that didn't stop the space from feeling wrong. The year following his death was the year everything began shifting inside my family. Visits from my older children grew shorter. Conversations grew colder. They started talking about my well-being more than anything else, though the tone never felt truly concerned. I brushed it off at the time, thinking grief had changed us all in ways we didn't understand yet. But grief wasn't the only thing changing. They started looking at my home, Arthur's assets, the trust he built, the land Silas owned, almost like evaluating merchandise. Their questions weren't about how I was holding up. They were about taxes, expenses, maintenance, and long-term plans. As if I were a project, not their mother. As if my life's work was a ledger to be reviewed. I remember sitting across from them at my own dining table, the same table where I had once served birthday cakes, and feeling a strange coldness settle in the room. I kept reminding myself, these are my children. The same children I rocked to sleep, the same children whose scraped knees I kissed, the same children I worked double shifts for when Arthur was traveling. They wouldn't hurt me. They wouldn't treat me like some burden. They wouldn't. But little signs kept collecting, short remarks, quick glances between them, falls in communication that didn't feel accidental. A shift in tone. A push toward dependence. A push toward me stepping aside. If you've ever felt overlooked by someone you raised, someone you trusted, let me ask you this. Did it make you wonder when they stopped seeing you as a person? At what moment did you become an obstacle instead of family? I didn't know it then, but their attitude wasn't just distance. It was strategy. And as the months went by, the warmth in my home thinned until it felt like I was living in a shell of what used to be. But even in that loneliness, I still had Silas's laughter faintly echoing in my memory. I held onto that warmth like a blanket. I had no idea that the truth behind their sudden concern, their sudden interest, and their sudden visits was far deeper than I assumed. I had no idea that a quiet plan had already formed long before that 2 a.m. phone lit up my bedroom. And I certainly didn't know how far they were willing to go. Silas was my youngest, but he often acted like the oldest. He had a way of grounding a room without raising his voice. He was the one who lingered after dinner to wash dishes with me. The one who called just to say he'd found a new song he wanted me to hear. The one who noticed when my hands shook from arthritis and quietly took over tasks without making me feel weak. Some children bring noise into a house. Silas brought steadiness. He loved road trips, quick escapes up north where the air felt cleaner and the lakes were calm. He'd return with stories about people he met, food he tried, and ideas for the future. He wanted to renovate an old property into something meaningful, something lively, something he could pass down someday. I used to tease him that he was too young to think about a legacy, but he always smiled and said, "It's never too early, Mom." The last time I saw him, he hugged me longer than usual. Not in a dramatic way, just warm and certain. I remember the feel of his denim jacket against my cheek and the slight scratch of his beard that he kept saying he'd trim tomorrow. He carried that familiar bright energy out the door, promising to call me once he stopped for gas. That call never came. When the police arrived, their faces told me everything before their words did. A patch of black ice. A semi-truck that couldn't brake fast enough. Early morning fog. They said he didn't suffer, but I don't think any mother truly believes that. The ache that settled in my chest that day has never fully lifted. It changed the way I breathed, the way I moved, the way the world sounded. Everything became too sharp and too quiet at the same time. The funeral was held on a cloudy afternoon, and I remember gripping the sides of the pew because my body wouldn't steady. People came with casseroles and soft voices, offering comfort that dissolved the moment they left the room. Grief, I learned, is not shared equally. Some carry a corner of it, mothers carry the whole weight. I tried to keep myself upright, but there were nights when the silence in the house pressed against me so hard I wondered if I'd ever find air again. Beatrice cried at the service, but her tears dried quickly. Theodore stood stiffly beside her, jaw tight, eyes red but distant. They mourned, yes, but something in them shifted. It wasn't just sorrow. It was calculation, though I didn't understand that part then. I only remember the way they pulled apart from me afterward, almost as if grief made them uncomfortable. As if they couldn't stand to sit with me in my sorrow. Silas's friends visited often. They shared stories that made me smile through tears. How he once helped a coworker fix a car at midnight. How he gave away more money than he should have. How he defended people who didn't have the courage to defend themselves. Every story felt like a thread tying him back to me. Losing him was losing the child who still saw me as a whole person, not as someone fading into age. The day I walked into his room after the funeral is a day I will never forget. His guitar was still leaning against his desk, the strings slightly dull from weeks of not being played. His jacket hung over the back of his chair. A coffee mug sat on the nightstand, empty except for a small stain at the bottom. The air still carried the faint smell of cedar from the cologne he used. Every object felt like a piece of him left behind, but touching them felt like intruding on a place that shouldn't be disturbed. I sat on his bed and cried until my throat burned. I kept his room untouched for months. Not out of denial, but because that space held a warmth I needed. A reminder that love existed in this house long before fear and manipulation took root. Even now, every time I stand in that doorway, I feel the whisper of his presence. The kind that doesn't frighten but settles on your shoulders like a comforting hand. The year after his death changed everything in my family. Grief reveals character like nothing else. Some people grow softer. Others grow sharper. Beatrice and Theodore didn't soften. They distanced themselves, speaking about Silas with a tone that felt strangely detached. When I mentioned memories, they redirected the conversation. When I spoke about my sadness, they exchanged glances that made me feel like a burden. It wasn't long before I realized that Silas had been the glue keeping us together more tightly than any of us knew. And as he faded from our daily routines, their true intentions began to slip through small cracks. Looks they exchanged, topics they avoided, the sudden urgency they developed regarding my well-being and long-term planning. But at the time, I didn't doubt them. I didn't want to. They were my children. I was still convinced that the distance, the coldness, the hint of annoyance in their voices was grief taking a strange shape. I had no idea that Silas's death wasn't the end of my pain. It was the beginning of a different kind altogether. A kind born not from loss, but from betrayal carried out by the very people who should have been my support. What I learned later about their motives would break the last piece of trust one had left. After the funeral, I expected my older children to linger, to help me sort through paperwork, or at least sit with me in silence the way families often do. Instead, Beatrice and Theodore shifted their attention almost immediately toward one thing: Silas's assets. Not his memory, not his projects, not the pieces of his life that still sat untouched in his room. No, what caught their interest was the financial trail he left behind. It started subtly. Beatrice came over one afternoon with a folder tucked under her arm. She claimed it was information I might want to review. Inside were property tax records, account summaries, and reports I hadn't asked for. She sat across from me with a certain look, a mix of impatience and quiet expectancy. "Mom," she said, tapping her pen, "we need to have an adult conversation about Silas's holdings." Adult conversation. As if I wasn't sitting right there, fully aware and capable. I listened politely at first, but with every sentence she spoke, it became clearer that her concern wasn't emotional. It was transactional. Then Theodore joined in. He called me one evening, his tone strangely clipped. "Mother, we need to discuss the property Silas was renovating. It's too much for you. You should let us handle the sale. These things can get complicated." Complicated. That was his favorite word when he wanted control. At first, I truly believed they were trying to help. Grief changes people, and I assumed this was their way of coping, redirecting their pain into numbers, decisions, and paperwork. But their eagerness didn't match their grief. It was too focused, too sharp, too invested in the result rather than the memory of the son we had just put to rest. When Desmond, Silas's lawyer, called to inform me of the updated will, everything shifted. My gentle boy had left his entire portfolio and that small property to me. Not a portion. Not divided among siblings. All of it. He made sure of it just a week before his death. Desmond spoke with genuine empathy. "Mrs. Vance, he wanted to secure your future. He said you'd spent your whole life securing his." I cried after that call. Not because of the money, but because Silas had thought about me, cared about my comfort, even at a time when he had his own life ahead of him. Beatrice did not react with the same warmth. She came to my house with Theodore, both dressed in formal work attire, as if they were arriving for a business negotiation. Beatrice placed her handbag on the table, sat down slowly, and stared at me with that lawyer's gaze she used in courtrooms. "Mom," she began, "there must be some mistake." "There isn't," I replied softly. Theodore leaned forward. Silas wasn't thinking clearly. That trip he took, he was exhausted. You know how easily he got overwhelmed. He wouldn't have made such a decision rationally. That statement landed like a slap across my face, suggesting my son was incapable of making decisions, suggesting he lacked clarity, suggesting that the weeks leading up to his death somehow made him unreliable. "He was clear-minded," I said, firmer now. "He told me he'd been updating his plans." Beatrice's jaw tightened. "Mom, please. You're emotional right now. This isn't about sentiment. We need to look at this logically." Logically. Another word people use when they want to strip emotion from someone else's experience. I stared at them, searching their faces for even a flicker of love. I didn't find it. Instead, I found calculation masked as concern. The following days confirmed everything I feared and more. They questioned the validity of the documents. They implied Desmond might have made errors. They even whispered that perhaps I pressured Silas, an accusation so cruel I still feel it in my chest when I think about it. But nothing prepared me for what Theodore said one morning on my porch. "Mother, you're elderly. Managing assets is not something you should be doing alone. We can take this off your hands." Take this off my hands. As if the last piece of my son, his final act of love, was just an item to be transferred. Their visits increased, but their tone became colder. They brought spreadsheets, proposals, projections. They wanted control over Silas's investments, Arthur's trust, and even my own home. Every conversation nudged me further into a corner, like they were trying to make me feel incapable, fragile, dependent. That wasn't love. That wasn't support. That was strategy. One evening, after they left abruptly, I sat alone at the dining table and noticed something painful. I no longer recognized the people they were becoming. My children, once full of potential and warmth, now seemed consumed by something else. Something that made them see me not as their mother but as a barrier in the way of their plans. And I kept asking myself a question that no mother ever wants to entertain. When did my children stop seeing me as family? What I didn't know was that this shift, their sudden urgency, their fixation on documents, their quiet frustration, was only the surface of a much deeper plan. Silas's death had opened a door to a side of them I never wanted to see. But soon, I would learn just how far they were willing to go to take everything Arthur worked for, and everything Silas entrusted to me. After Silas passed and the truth about his will came out, something shifted in my home. A slow change, almost silent at first. It began with fewer phone calls. A day or two with no messages didn't bother me at the start. Adults get busy. But days became weeks. Messages felt shorter, colder, almost scripted. When I reached out, my calls often went to voicemail, and the returned calls came hours later with hurried tones as if I had interrupted something more important. At first, I blamed grief. I told myself Beatrice and Theodore were coping in their own ways, trying to adjust to a world without their brother. But grief doesn't make children treat their mother like a client. Grief doesn't make them talk to you as if you are an obligation on a to-do list. Their behavior gradually shifted from distant to managerial. It was no longer, "How are you holding up, Mom?" but "Have you looked at the insurance papers?" Not, "Do you want company tonight?" but "Do you need help downsizing your responsibilities?" Downsizing. That word stung. My life wasn't a company. My home wasn't an office. And I certainly wasn't an employee being reassigned. They began scheduling their visits like business meetings. I had to confirm availability, as if I were meeting with strangers instead of my own children. When they did arrive, they stayed by the doorway longer than they stayed on the couch. Their eyes swept across my living room like they were analyzing assets rather than visiting family. One afternoon, Theodore came by with a leather folder tucked under his arm. He barely greeted me before sitting at the table and spreading out documents. "Mother, you should consider letting us manage your expenses. It's too much for one person." Too much. As if I hadn't run this household for decades. As if I hadn't paid every bill, handled every emergency, survived every hardship long before either of them had the faintest sense of responsibility. I told him I was capable. He smiled, tight, rehearsed, dismissive, and said, "You're strong, but you're aging. It's not an insult. It's just reality." I felt something crack inside me that day. Not a break, but a shift, like the closing of a door I hadn't realized was open. The comments continued. Subtle nudges, quiet pokes at my stability. "Are you sure you remember everything clearly, Mom? You looked confused when we talked last week. Do you think maybe you should have someone help you full-time?" The words weren't loud, but they were sharp. Sharp enough to leave marks. Beatrice joined the routine with her own brand of cold concern. She would walk through my home as if conducting an inspection, gently touching furniture, lifting mail off the counter, glancing at unopened envelopes with raised eyebrows. One day she looked at a simple electricity bill and said, "This is overdue. You can't keep track of things the way you used to." I hadn't paid it yet because it was delivered that morning. They started suggesting I sign simple documents to make my life easier, documents they framed as support measures. They phrased everything with the tone of caretakers, but their eyes told another story. Their eyes didn't hold empathy. They held evaluation. Friends from the neighborhood noticed, too. My neighbor, Carol, asked me why my kids never stopped by anymore. She said she used to see them bring groceries, help in the yard, chat on the porch. Now they came like guests who wanted to leave as soon as politeness allowed. The loneliness grew thicker. Not the kind that comes from living alone, but the kind that forms when the people who should love you start treating you like a burden. Days felt longer. Nights felt colder. And my home, once a place filled with laughter, felt like a waiting room where no one returned calls. Then came the conversations about my memory, always delivered in soft voices, always framed as concern. "Mom, you repeat yourself sometimes. It's concerning. You forgot what day it was last week. Maybe you should consider a medical evaluation. You need rest. You're overexerting yourself. I caught on quickly. These weren't casual comments. They were coordinated, calculated, and consistent. They wanted to build a case, not for my well-being, but for control. Every slip of the tongue, every misplaced key, every small, ordinary lapse humans experience was treated as evidence. Evidence of weakness. Evidence of unreliability. Evidence they could use against me. I remember one Sunday dinner when Theodore paused mid-conversation and said, "Mother, are you sure you're okay? You look a bit lost." I wasn't lost. I was thinking. But to him, thinking and confusion were the same if it benefited his goal. If you have ever felt someone constructing a narrative about you, one you never agreed to and certainly never lived, you know how suffocating it feels. You start questioning yourself. You start second-guessing your own certainty. You feel yourself shrinking, not because you're weak, but because someone keeps trying to fold you into a smaller shape. Their visits no longer brought comfort. They brought tension. I started bracing myself when the doorbell rang. My heart would tighten before I even opened the door, wondering what new concern they would present, what new line they would cross, what new piece of evidence they would collect. I tried confronting them gently. I tried asking if they were worried about something specific, but they always responded with polished reassurances and the type of smiles people use when they think they are outsmarting you. What I didn't realize was that they had already started laying the foundation for something far more serious than emotional distance. They weren't just isolating me. They were preparing a case, one that would later become the key to their betrayal. Their comments, their concern, their scheduled visits, every one of them was a step toward a plan that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with positioning themselves for what they believed they were entitled to. I didn't know the full picture yet. I only knew the house felt colder, my days felt quieter, and my own children felt further away than strangers. But the truth behind their behavior wouldn't stay hidden forever. Arthur was never a dramatic man. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rush into decisions, and didn't leave unfinished plans for others to clean up. He believed in structure, in preparing for the future, and in protecting the people he cared about. Long before his health declined, he began drafting a detailed estate plan that reflected exactly who he was: steady, thoughtful, and cautious. After he passed, most of his provisions were straightforward. The house, the savings, the lake cottage, everything was meant to support me for the rest of my life. And eventually, when I was gone, the remaining assets would be divided equally among our 3 children. A fair arrangement, the kind most families wish for. But Arthur wasn't blind to the shifting behaviors of our older children. He loved them, of course, but he noticed their ambition growing sharper with age. He saw how quickly they became impatient when responsibilities fell on their shoulders. He saw how their priorities leaned toward status, titles, promotions, and appearances. He often said, "Love them dearly, but protect yourself wisely." That's why he created something separate, something he didn't discuss casually: the Vance Family Legacy Trust. It was substantial, much larger than anything our children knew about. He built it with the intention of safeguarding our family's future while ensuring I would never be forced into dependence or vulnerability. But the heart of that trust wasn't the money, it was the clause he wrote into it. The clause stated that the principal would pass only to the children who maintained a consistent, caring, and supportive relationship with me during my final years. Not occasional calls. Not polite obligations. Genuine care. Genuine presence. Arthur told me about this clause long before he died. Not because he expected conflict, but because he understood the reality of human nature. Kindness can't be forced, he had said, but it can be recognized and rewarded. I just want to be sure you're never left standing alone. I didn't quite grasp the weight of his words until after Silas passed. You see, Silas was the one who visited weekly, who checked on me during storms, who handled small repairs before I even noticed them. He made time for me, not out of duty but out of love. He fulfilled Arthur's clause without even knowing it existed. Beatrice and Theodore, on the other hand, treated me like a footnote. They came only when convenient. They called only when they needed something. Their affection was conditional, their availability brief. Arthur saw the pattern years before it became obvious to me. After Silas died, the distance between my older children and me widened quickly. And that distance wasn't just emotional, it became strategic. They understood the clause more clearly than I did at the time, and they understood what it meant for their future. They were at risk of losing everything they believed they were entitled to. One evening, while sorting through Arthur's documents, I reread the trust provisions. The words hit me harder than they had years before. Only the children who maintained honest support and care would receive the trust after my passing. Silas had met that requirement effortlessly. Beatrice and Theodore had not. And deep down, they knew it. Suddenly, their behavior made sense, not as grief, not as business, but as calculation. Their sudden interest in my daily life, their abrupt concern about my health, their sudden need to manage things for me, all of it aligned disturbingly well with preserving their claim to the trust. What they never expected was that I would see through it. I began noticing how Beatrice's eyes flickered whenever the trust was mentioned. How Theodore's tone tightened during conversations about long-term planning. How they frequently brought up my age, not with genuine worry, but with rehearsed lines meant to highlight vulnerability. They weren't evaluating my well-being. They were evaluating their chances. One afternoon, Beatrice said something that still chills me. She placed her coffee cup on the table, folded her hands neatly, and said, "Dad always wanted the estate to be secure. The trust is meant for the children who will carry his legacy responsibly." She emphasized children who will carry his legacy, as if she was already positioning herself and Theodore as the rightful heirs. As if the trust was waiting for them the moment I took my last breath. I looked at her and replied, "Your father wanted the trust to go to the children who showed love when it mattered, not only when it was convenient." She paused, just for a moment, and in that brief silence, I saw something bitter flicker behind her expression, a glimpse of fear. Not fear of losing me, fear of losing the money she believed was guaranteed. Theodore was less subtle. His comments became sharper over time. "Mother, you need us. You can't handle everything alone. It's irresponsible not to let us manage the trust correctly. You're making emotional decisions, not logical ones." Every remark chipped away at the facade they were trying to maintain. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the clause that could cut them off entirely. And once I realized that Arthur's trust had become the silent battlefield underlying their every move, everything clicked into place. Their coldness, their strategic visits, their pressure, it was all tied to securing their position before the clause exposed their lack of genuine care. But what neither of them realized was this. Arthur had built that clause not just to protect the trust, but to protect me. And soon, it would become the very shield that kept them from taking everything he worked for. They thought they were preparing for their inheritance. They had no idea the clause they feared the most would be the thing that destroyed their plan. The day everything shifted from discomfort to outright treachery wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors. Just a quiet morning where I realized my own children no longer saw me as a parent, but as an obstacle they needed to handle. It began with a phone call from Theodore. His voice was unusually firm, the kind of tone he used during high-stakes business meetings. "Mother, Beatrice and I need you to come to the house this afternoon. We have documents to review." Documents. They never asked how I was, never asked about my sleep, my health, whether I had eaten. Everything came back to paperwork. When I arrived, Beatrice had already arranged a display of folders on the dining table. She stood beside them like an attorney preparing evidence for trial. Theodore hovered near the window, pretending to look busy, but his tension was visible a mile away. Their rehearsed calm told me they had planned this moment in detail. "Mom," Beatrice began, gesturing toward the chair across from her. "We've gone over your accounts, the property values, and the trust statements. Things are getting overwhelming for you." I sat down slowly. "Overwhelming? For me? Or for you?" She ignored the question and slid a packet toward me. "This is a protective arrangement. You'll remain comfortable, but Theodore and I will manage all major decisions. It's the safest option." Safest. Another one of their loaded words. I opened the packet. Page after page of legal language, each paragraph thicker than the last. But even without reading every word, I saw the intent clearly. They wanted legal control over everything Arthur left behind. And once they had it, I would be reduced to a figure they could move around on their ledger. You're asking me to hand over my life, I said quietly. Theodore stepped forward, arms crossed. No, we're asking you to be realistic. You're older now. You forget things. It felt like cold water down my back. I forget things. I repeated. Is that truly what you think? He didn't blink. Yes, and that concerns us. Not a trace of kindness. Not a trace of hesitation. Only strategy. Beatrice leaned in. Mom, you need to sign. If you refuse, things may get complicated with the trust later. You don't want the courts thinking you're unable to manage your affairs. There it was. The threat buried in gentle phrasing. I pushed the papers back. I haven't shown any signs of inability. You're creating them. Theodore's jaw flexed. That's not what this is. But it was. And deep down, they knew I saw it. Over the next weeks, their behavior grew tighter, more coordinated. They visited not to bring comfort or food or conversation, but to check whether I had changed my mind. They spoke to me with a tone that walked the line between politeness and pressure. Sometimes, Beatrice would arrive with a folder just to review one more thing. Other days, Theodore casually mentioned how people my age shouldn't be left alone with complicated responsibilities. They shared articles about elder fraud, about cognitive decline, about the dangers of isolation, all presented as concern, but dripping with manipulation. They didn't want to protect me. They wanted documentation to use against me. The day I realized they had involved outside professionals was the day a man I had never met knocked on my door. He introduced himself as a wellness evaluator hired by the family. He wanted to assess my daily capability. I refused to let him inside. That refusal cost me. Beatrice called, furious, controlling her voice through clenched teeth. Mom, you need to cooperate. These assessments protect you. Protect me from what? I asked. Her silence revealed everything. From them. The real breaking point came during a family meeting they arranged at Theodore's house. They claimed we needed to finalize my future planning. I walked in with my back straight and my mind clear. Beatrice had a thick envelope ready. Theodore stood behind her like an enforcer. Mom, she said, if you don't sign today, we'll have no choice but to pursue guardianship. I felt the air leave my lungs. Guardianship? You want to declare your own mother incapable? Theodore didn't flinch. If that's what it takes to protect the estate, yes. There was no hesitation, no guilt, just certainty, as if they had rehearsed this line for weeks. You're proving Arthur's clause without even realizing it, I whispered. Beatrice froze. What clause? I stared at her long enough to make her uncomfortable. The one your father wrote for people who abandon love for control. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. Her expression tightened, but she didn't ask more. She didn't want the answer, she feared it. They pushed the pen toward me. You sign today, Theodore said, or we take it to court. His voice didn't shake. Mine didn't either. No. They stared at me as if I had committed an offense against reason itself. For the first time in my life, I saw raw greed in my children's eyes. The kind that makes people cross lines they once swore they'd never approach. I walked out of their house with one truth carved permanently into my heart. They weren't targeting the assets. They were targeting me. And if they were willing to force guardianship, if they were ready to declare me incompetent, then this wasn't just conflict anymore. This was war. They thought they were tightening their grip. What they didn't know was that every step they took was leading them straight into the proof I needed. The proof that would destroy their entire scheme. There comes a point in every fight where you realize the person across from you is willing to go further than you ever expected. For me, that moment came on a frost-heavy night when the air outside felt sharp enough to cut through cloth. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from another day of dodging phone calls from Theodore and politely declining Beatrice's offers to stop by with more documents. My sleep was light, the kind where the body rests but the mind stays on watch. So when a faint vibration hummed through my dresser, I woke instantly. I thought it was the house settling. Old wood has a way of groaning at night, but the sound persisted. When I opened the drawer, my hands turned cold. Arthur's phone, the one I kept charged but never used, sat there glowing. A blocked number was calling, but the contact name flashing across the screen was unmistakable. Silas, mobile. My heart buckled. For a moment I couldn't even breathe. Grief is strange. Years can pass, but one reminder can pull you back into the first hour of loss. I stared at the screen, unable to move. The phone stopped ringing. I thought it was over, but a moment later, the speaker crackled softly. A faint voice, thin, strained, barely audible, whispered through the static. "Mom, let me in, it's cold." Every hair on my arms rose. My entire body felt hollow. The cadence, the softness, the way he stretched the word mom, it was identical to the way Silas used to call me when he needed help. I dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the voice fading as it rolled under the nightstand. I should have turned on the lights. I should have sat still. But something in me insisted I check the front door. Years of motherhood had built a reflex I couldn't turn off. The hallway felt longer than usual. Each step was heavy, like walking through wet sand. When I reached the entryway, my pulse was pounding so loud it felt like it filled the room. I didn't open the door. I didn't dare. Instead, I moved toward the small window beside the frame and shifted the curtain by barely an inch. And there, still as a statue under the streetlight, stood Silas. His denim jacket, his posture, his familiar way of leaning slightly forward as if he were waiting for me to speak first. For an instant, every part of me screamed to run toward the door and yank it open. But something was off. He wasn't breathing. His chest didn't rise. And the air around him didn't stir, even though the winter wind had been loud all evening. He lifted his hand slowly and placed it on the glass. His eyes met mine, wide and pleading. "Mom, please help me." Not spoken, just mouthed. The emotional blow was so intense I staggered backward, gripping the wall to keep myself upright. My heart didn't race, it squeezed, as if someone had wrapped a fist around it. I blinked, and he began to fade into the shadows, step by step, until the night swallowed him whole. I stayed frozen in place for nearly half an hour. Not crying, not panicking, just numb. When morning came, the numbness melted into suspicion. Grief can cause illusions. Yes. Memories can play tricks. Yes. But phones do not call from the dead. Phones without active numbers do not light up with contact names that shouldn't exist anymore. Someone had done this. Someone who wanted me to break. Someone who wanted the world to believe I was losing my grip on reality. And who had the resources, connections, and relentless motivation to engineer something like that. Only two people came to mind. That afternoon, I called Desmond, my late son's attorney, the only person I trusted without hesitation. When I told him what happened, he didn't dismiss me or chalk it up to age. Instead, he grew quiet. Too quiet. "Patricia," he finally said, "Arthur's phone number was deactivated years ago. It shouldn't accept or receive calls. Even spoofing it wouldn't make the old contact name appear. Someone manipulated the device itself." He hesitated, then added, "And there's something else you need to hear. Silas's phone, the one he had on the day of the accident, pinged on a network tower here in Willow Creek 3 nights ago." My fingers locked around the phone. But the police said it was destroyed. That's what the report claimed. But if it pinged, someone has it. There was only one person in my family with enough influence in tech circles and enough lack of conscience to pull something this sickening off. Theodore. I thought the nighttime visit was grief haunting me. Now I saw it clearly. It was psychological warfare. A tactic. A setup. A staged moment designed to push me toward a diagnosis that would hand them full control of the estate. If they were willing to hire someone to impersonate my dead son, If they were willing to manipulate Arthur's old phone. If they were bold enough to use my deepest wound as leverage. Then they were hiding something massive. Something even bigger than Silas's inheritance or the trust. Something so valuable they were ready to drive their own mother into mental ruin to secure it. The chill I felt that night wasn't from the cold. It was the realization that my children weren't just greedy. They were dangerous. And if they were running a campaign this extreme, then the only way to survive it was to turn their tactics against them. They wanted to break me. Instead, they awakened the part of me they underestimated most. The part that refuses to be erased. After the staged call and the porch sighting, the fear didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It stopped being the kind that freezes your body and turned into the kind that sharpens your mind. That night didn't break me. It awakened me. I realized something crucial. If they wanted me confused, unsteady, and frightened, then the smartest thing I could do was the opposite. I needed to be alert, focused, quiet, patient. My children expected panic. They expected breakdowns. They expected an emotional collapse they could document and present as evidence. What they never expected was that their elderly mother still knew how to read people, especially the two she raised from birth. So I began watching. The first thing I noticed was how cautious they became. They were careful with their tone, careful with their words, careful not to push too hard too quickly. They were afraid of looking aggressive. It told me they had advisors coaching them through every move. The second thing I noticed was their guilt. Not the kind that makes someone confess, but the kind that makes someone overcompensate. The kind that reveals cracks in a story. Every conversation started with rehearsed kindness. Mom, we're just trying to help. Mom, we want what's best for you. Mom, we're worried. Worried. But never about my well-being. Only about the estate. Only about control. And their timing told me something even more revealing. Every time they pressured me to sign new paperwork or undergo an evaluation, something else had just happened. Another delay in the trust schedule. Another reminder from the attorney overseeing Arthur's instructions. Another moment that put them closer to losing access if they didn't act fast. It became clear. They weren't operating from strength. They were operating from fear. Fear of losing what they believed they deserved. Fear of me keeping what Arthur intended for me. Fear of Silas's decisions overshadowing theirs even after his death. That fear made them sloppy. Over the next few days, I monitored patterns. Beatrice called every morning at 8 a.m. sharp. She never missed. She always sounded rushed, breathless, like she was juggling two crises at once. That alone was suspicious. A woman who once made her living arguing cases couldn't hide anxiety from her own mother. She was trying too hard to stay composed. Theodore's behavior was different. He didn't call often. He preferred showing up in person without warning, pretending it was just to check on me. But I knew him too well. Whenever Theodore appeared without notice, it meant he was hiding something. He couldn't lie over the phone. He needed to control the room, watch reactions, steer the conversation. Their behavior was coordinated. Someone was directing them. And that someone wasn't me. So I changed my approach. I stopped questioning them. I became agreeable, pleasant, cooperative. Not truly, but enough to make them relax. I returned their calls promptly. I asked questions that made me sound uncertain. I allowed them to explain things to me in that patronizing tone of theirs. It worked. Within a week, they started dropping hints they never meant to reveal. Beatrice slipped first. During a tense conversation over tea, she muttered, "If you just signed everything 2 months ago, we wouldn't be in this rush." 2 months ago, when the trust's yearly review was approaching, she was admitting the pressure wasn't about my well-being, it was about a deadline. Theodore revealed even more than he intended. He commented, almost casually, "We need to finish everything before the next audit. The numbers have to match." The numbers. The audit. Match. The way he said it wasn't the way a son worries about his mother's future. It was the way a man fears exposure, financial exposure. Something was wrong with his accounts. Something Silas knew about. Something he warned Theodore about before he died. Piece by piece, their scheme was no longer a mystery. It was a structure, and every time they spoke, they loosened another screw holding it together. I knew I needed an ally who wouldn't scare them off. Someone who understood the law, yes, but also understood deception, timing, and manipulation. Desmond fit that role perfectly. When I shared everything with him, the staged call, the porch figure, the strange behavior, he didn't look at me with pity. He didn't question my sanity. He leaned forward and said, "Patricia, whatever they're trying to do, it's not small. People don't stage things like that unless they're desperate. We need to watch them the same way they've been watching you." He helped me check the old phone. He recorded the error logs. He traced the strange activity. Every piece of information we found pointed to the same truth. Someone had tampered with both devices recently. Someone with access, money, and the motivation to ruin my credibility. Desmond urged caution. He told me not to confront them yet. He told me we needed them to expose themselves fully, in their own words. "Let them believe their plan is working," he said. "People reveal the most when they think victory is close." And he was right. So I waited, and watched, and listened. I didn't fight their false concern. I didn't argue about documents. I didn't challenge their claims. I simply played the role of the frail mother who was losing her footing. And as they grew more confident, their mistakes multiplied. Their arrogance made them sloppy. Their eagerness made them reckless. They thought the game was approaching the finish line. But the truth was, their final mistake was still waiting to be made. A mistake so severe it would shatter the entire scheme they worked years to construct. All I had to do was be ready when it arrived. Once I understood what my children were doing, the fear that had haunted me for weeks shifted into something sharper. Not anger, clarity. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw a path forward. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't easy, but it was steady. All I had to do was follow it without rushing. My children thought they were tightening the noose, but I was weaving a net. The first step was simple. Let them believe I was slipping. So I did something that hurt my pride more than any insult ever could. I began acting slightly confused on purpose. Not drastically, just enough to make them comfortable. When Beatrice asked a question, I would pause a moment longer than usual before answering. When Theodore dropped by with his false concern, I pretended to misplace my reading glasses. Small things, minor things, things that gave them confidence that their pressure was working. I hated every second of it. But I also knew that people reveal their deepest intentions when they believe they've already won. And they did. Within days, their tone changed. They grew bolder. Beatrice started bringing paperwork again, just to review, she'd say, walking into my house like she was inspecting a property she planned to take over. She'd set the papers on my kitchen table, her pen conveniently placed on top as though she expected me to reach for it on instinct. Theodore grew more controlling. He started checking the house for safety hazards. He offered to install cameras for my protection. He even hinted that a medical evaluation might be needed soon, just so the court knows everything is in order. That was the moment I knew they were preparing their final move. But so was I. I began quietly documenting everything. Every visit. Every conversation. Every comment where they mentioned my age, my memory, my supposed confusion. I wrote down dates, times, and exact lines they said. Not for drama. For court. The truth may feel heavy at first, but it becomes sharp when handled correctly. Desmond helped me structure the notes so that they could be used as formal evidence. He visited twice a week, always entering through the back gate so no one would notice. We spoke in the laundry room with the appliances running so any outside ears would pick up only noise. He showed me how to keep a log in a coded notebook disguised as a recipe journal. If Theodore or Beatrice ever found it, they'd believe it was nothing more than old baking instructions. But the real brilliance of the plan came from something Desmond said during one of our meetings. You can't prove manipulation by arguing with them. You prove it by letting them expose themselves. They need to feel comfortable enough to slip. So I waited for the slip. And soon, I got it. One afternoon, Beatrice arrived unannounced. She didn't bother knocking. She strode inside with a confidence that made my stomach tighten. "Mom, we need to discuss your mail. Important documents are left unopened," she said, waving a handful of envelopes I had actually placed aside on purpose. I widened my eyes slightly, just enough to sell the illusion. "I meant to get to them." Her face softened, only for a moment. Then her tone changed. "You know, the court looks at things like this. They look at whether a person is managing daily responsibilities." There it was, a threat disguised as concern. I noted every word. While she lectured me, I asked a question that appeared innocent but was anything but. "Beatrice, sweetheart, when will all this paperwork stop? When the trust is settled?" She blinked. The slightest twitch. She hadn't expected me to know about the trust deadline. Her voice tightened. "Why are you asking about that?" I shrugged weakly, just wondering. But she had already told me everything. She feared the deadline. She feared losing access. She feared the clause Arthur wrote. Her reaction proved they were scrambling. Theodore slipped next. He visited 2 nights later. He walked through the living room with the expression of a man inspecting merchandise. Then he said something that confirmed my worst suspicions. "Mom, you keep asking questions about deadlines. Beatrice and I are handling everything. You don't need to concern yourself with financial timelines." He shouldn't have said timelines. Not if this was innocent. Not if they were protecting me. Timelines matter only when something is at risk. And something was definitely at risk. He pressed on, hoping to catch me off guard. "We need you to sign one more document this week. After that, everything will be smooth." He clarified nothing, explained nothing, just pushed. That was my confirmation. They weren't just trying to secure the estate. They were racing a clock that terrified them. The trap was working. Over the next week, I tightened the strategy even further. I planted small hints, carefully designed to sound unintentional, suggesting I might be considering their paperwork. A sigh here, a vague comment there, a question about forms. Anything to make them lower their guard. They took the bait. Their visits increased. Their calls doubled. Every time they pushed harder, they revealed more. Desmond reviewed my notes and pointed out patterns I hadn't even noticed. He began assembling my documentation into a structured timeline, each entry supporting Arthur's clause. The requirement that only children who showed consistent support, love, and respect could inherit the trust's principle. Everything they were doing was proving the opposite. The more they pressured me, the more they erased their own chance at the inheritance. They didn't know it yet, but they were signing their own financial death certificates. By the end of the month, I had what I needed. A full log of coercion. A collection of thinly veiled threats. Recordings of contradictory statements. Documented attempts to force legal control. Clear evidence of psychological pressure. The only step remaining was to trigger the moment that would expose them completely. A moment that would make them show their true intentions without hesitation. A moment they wouldn't be able to deny, explain, or bury. And once that moment arrived, their entire scheme would collapse in front of them, because the truth was about to step out of the shadows in a way they never prepared for. The next move wasn't mine. It was theirs. And it was coming. I thought the first appearance was the worst thing they could do to me. I believed there was no lower place for a child to drag their own mother. But greed does something strange to the mind. It convinces people they're justified in crossing any line, even lines they once swore they'd never touch. The second attack proved that. It happened on a Sunday night, one of those quiet evenings when the world feels like it's wrapped in cotton. I'd spent most of the day writing in my coded journal, organizing the notes Desmond wanted me to prepare. I felt steady, prepared, ready for whatever they were plotting next. But nothing could have prepared me for that night. It was close to midnight when the house began to feel off. Not visually, not in any dramatic way. The change was subtle. The air felt unusually still. Even the refrigerator seemed quieter than usual. These were tiny sensations, but when you live alone, you notice when your environment shifts. I brushed it off and went to make myself tea. As the kettle heated, I heard a soft tap on the wall behind me. Not loud, not aggressive, just a faint, irregular tapping, like fingertips lightly brushing wood. My first instinct was to ignore it. The house is old, sounds happen. But then the tapping came again, closer this time, almost rhythmic. I stood still, gripping the counter. Not tonight, I whispered to myself. But the house didn't care. The tapping grew louder. Slow. Intentional. Tap. 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 My breathing tightened. Then, cutting through the tapping, my phone, Arthur's phone, lit up on the kitchen table. It was ringing. My heart dropped into my stomach. The contact name on the screen read, Silas, mobile. Again. I stared at it, trembling. The ringing continued, echoing through the silent house. I couldn't move, couldn't reach for it, couldn't look away. When it stopped ringing, a low crackle filled the speaker. Mom! My knees weakened. I'm outside. Please, open the door. The words dragged out like they were stretched through miles of static. Every part of me wanted to scream for help, but my throat locked up. I turned toward the hallway with slow, mechanical steps. My hands shook violently. My legs felt unsteady. This time, I didn't want to go to the door. This time, fear fought logic with equal strength. But something inside me pushed forward, some quiet instinct that said, if you don't face this now, they will win. I reached the entryway. I reached the window. I pulled back the curtain a fraction. And there he was again. Silas. But this time, the figure wasn't standing still. He was swaying, back and forth, like he was fighting to stay upright. His head hung low. His arms hung limp. His jacket, the one he always wore in winter, was soaked through as if drenched in rain. Yet there was no rain outside. His hair was matted to one side, and his face looked pale enough to glow under the streetlight. Something about the posture was wrong. Horribly wrong. Slowly, the figure lifted its head. His eyes, dark, hollow, almost sunken, locked onto mine. Mom, please. My stomach twisted. Not from fear, from recognition. The man on my porch was not Silas. He was taller by an inch or two, broader in the shoulders. His stance was different. The face was similar enough to fool anyone in panic, but not a mother. My grief had tricked me once. It wouldn't trick me twice. I leaned closer to the glass to confirm what my mind already knew. And then, just for a split second, the man on the porch turned his head slightly to the left. That single movement exposed the truth. The left ear. It wasn't Silas's ear. He had a small scar there from when he fell off his bicycle at 12 years old. I cleaned that wound myself. I held him while he cried. I knew that scar by heart. This man didn't have it. The breath I'd been holding escaped my chest in a harsh, shaky exhale. It was an actor. A hired stand-in. Someone coached to mimic my dead son's mannerisms. Someone trained to break a 70-year-old woman's grip on reality. My hands curled into fists. For the first time since the hauntings began, I felt something stronger than fear. Rage. Deep, steady, razor-sharp rage. How dare they use my son like this? How dare they turn his memory into a tool? How dare they assume I would collapse on command? I stayed at the window, staring at the man who dared to impersonate my boy. He didn't see me. Not fully. His gaze was fixed at just the wrong angle, rehearsed, pre-calculated to seem authentic. He wasn't looking for me. He was performing. When he finished his plea, he turned and walked down the steps, same speed as the first time, same pattern, same direction, toward the shadows. Exactly rehearsed. Exactly planned. Exactly wrong. I remained there, watching until he disappeared from sight. Not afraid. Not broken. Fully awake. The next morning, I didn't call Theodore or Beatrice. I didn't confront them. I didn't accuse them. I simply called Desmond and told him, it happened again. He arrived within 20 minutes. When I described the second appearance, he didn't pause. He didn't question me. He said one thing. They overplayed their hand. That was the moment my doubt evaporated completely. My children weren't preparing a legal maneuver. They were preparing a demolition. They wanted to destroy my credibility so thoroughly that no judge, no attorney, no court-appointed evaluator would ever listen to me. But in their desperation, they had revealed a fatal truth. This wasn't just elder manipulation. This was premeditated psychological assault. And I suddenly knew, without question, that they were hiding something far bigger than anything they had admitted. Something worth orchestrating these performances. Something worth spending money on actors and tech experts. Something worth risking prison for. Silas had been trying to protect me. Even in death, he was pointing me toward the truth. And now, I was ready to follow it. Because the next move would not be theirs. It would be mine. The morning after the second performance, everything inside me shifted. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't confused. I was done being hunted in my own home. The actor's visit didn't break me. It confirmed what I suspected for weeks. My children were hiding something enormous. Something tied to Silas. Something tied to the trust. Something they were terrified would reach daylight. So I moved. I called Desmond and said for words I hadn't said since Arthur passed. It's time for action. We set the plan in motion immediately. Desmond contacted a forensic technician he trusted, a quiet man with decades of experience analyzing phone tampering. Together, they retrieved data from Arthur's device and traced the source of the ghost calls. The results were damning. The calls weren't random. They weren't glitches. They were triggered manually from a system routed through a private server Theodore used for his firm. And the porch actor? His face appeared in a database of freelance performers used by investigative contractors. The final blow came when the technician accessed something Theodore never expected us to find. A hidden folder containing financial records that Silas had backed up to his personal cloud. Records showing money missing from Theodore's company. Money quietly rerouted into accounts linked to him and Beatrice. Silas had discovered it. He had threatened to expose it. And after he died, Theodore used the crash as an excuse to retrieve and alter the evidence. That was the secret they were protecting. Not the trust. Not the inheritance. Their reputations. Their status. Their careers built on lies. The hauntings weren't cruelty for cruelty's sake. They were panic. My children weren't thinking rationally anymore. They were drowning, and they wanted to take me down with them. But this time, I had proof. Desmond filed a petition with the probate court and submitted everything. The manipulated calls. The actors booking information. The financial trail. The recordings of their thinly veiled threats. The documented timeline of psychological pressure. Arthur's clause, requiring genuine support and emotional care, had never been clearer. Not only had they failed it, they had violated it in ways the judge described as a coordinated assault. The hearing was swift. Theodore and Beatrice arrived with their lawyers, confident as ever. Their arrogance cracked when the judge played the audio logs from the tech analysis. When their hired actor's name was read aloud in the courtroom, Theodore turned pale. When their financial theft was displayed on the monitor, Beatrice sank into her chair like the air had been knocked out of her. For the first time in years, they had nothing to say. The ruling was final. They forfeited all rights to Arthur's trust. They lost all claims to Silas's estate. They were removed as conservators. They were ordered into a separate investigation for financial fraud. I walked out of the courtroom with my cane in one hand and my pride in the other. Not victorious, just free. They tried to bury me. They tried to erase me. They tried to turn my grief into a weapon. Instead, the truth they feared became the very thing that destroyed their scheme. As for Silas, sometimes, when the house is quiet, I sit in his old room and let the memories settle around me. Not as ghosts, not as tricks, but as reminders of the one child who never treated love like a transaction. His presence, whatever form it takes, feels peaceful now. Not frightening, not heavy, just steady. Like a hand on my shoulder saying, "You made it, Mom." And I did. Before I close this story, let me speak directly to everyone listening. People think danger comes from strangers, but sometimes it grows quietly in your own family. If what happened to me ever happened to someone you love, would they know what to do? Would they know the signs? Would they know the traps? Don't wait to find out. Subscribe so you never miss stories that protect families from hidden threats. And if you still choose not to subscribe, at least tell me why in the comments. I'm listening. Fear only wins when we stay silent. Thank you for hearing my truth. And remember, sometimes the loudest revenge is simply living long enough to tell the story yourself.